Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Ventilation Forum Behind the Scenes ICU Stories podcast. My name is Jason Phua, and today we are really happy to have Dr. Wes Ely with us. Dr. Wes Ely, as many of you would know, is the Grant W. Liddle Endowed Chair in Medicine and is a physician, scientist, and tenured professor at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. He's also the Associate Director of Aging Research for the Tennessee Valley Veterans Affairs Geriatric Research Education Clinical Center. And he's the founder and co-director of the Critical Illness, Brain Dysfunction, and Survivorship Center. Dr. Ely is well known to us as a clinician, researcher, intensivist, respiratory physician. He's published lots of papers, high-impact ones in the New England Journal of Medicine, JAMA, Lancet, on liberation from mechanical ventilation, on delirium, on post-intensive care syndrome. And importantly, Dr. Ely, could I trouble you to show the book? Yeah, he recently published, and this is September 2020, a really impactful, powerful book, hashtag EDDB, Every DeepDrawn Breath, and you can see the words there, Critical Care Doctor on Healing, Recovery, and Transforming Medicine in the ICU. And I've read the book, Dr. Ely, thanks. And I see it as a description of maybe your transformation or your growth as a physician from one who's more focused on acute organ dysfunctions, a human being with a set of organs, to a human being as an individual, as a person who is a son, is a child, a daughter, etc., etc. I also see it as a description of how you think critical care should go from something that's really cold, four walls, machines beeping, etc., to something that really looks at a very sick patient as a person that we try to help, even if we may not be able to save his life, or maybe we will. So maybe could we just start, Dr. Ely, by asking you what inspired you to write this really inspiring book?
Dr. Phua, thank you so much for having me. And to all those who are listening, I want to thank you for giving up time from your busy day to explore this area with us of rehumanizing care of the person in the bed. You know, when I was a young, non-gray-haired intensivist, I really thought that it was my job just to put the patient on life support, get that intervention there, and that I was technology-driven as a doctor. And I thought of myself as kind of like a next-level doctor that would take care of these people who were going to die if I wasn't there. But what I realized was that I wasn't meeting them where they needed me. Yes, the support was great, the technology was great, but I failed them in so many ways on the back end of that because they got injured and harmed by my care, directly by things I did, like keeping them too deeply sedated, which injured their brain, immobilizing them, which injured their muscles and nerves, and which also grew them into a place where they left with mental health problems like PTSD, dementia, depression, and really the inability to go on with their lives. And I felt guilty and carried the shame and the guilt of that with me for many years. But I think that we have a very hopeful way forward. And I think that through EDDB, the message of Every DeepDrawn Breath, which is not a book about me, it's a book about human beings and life, really, I think. It's all told with true stories, real people, real names. In fact, all their pictures are on our website. If you go to icudelirium.org, you can go to the Every DeepDrawn Breath page, and there's a photo gallery, which a lot of people haven't found yet, of all their pictures. So I think that the main message here, and what's inspired me to write it, was that we have to do our job better so that we take care of the entire person, whole person care, and not just their failing lung or their failing heart or their failing kidneys. And that's really the main message. And everything about this project, this hashtag EDDB or hashtag Every DeepDrawn Breath, all the money, all the attention goes back to the patients, back to the loved ones to help them rebuild their lives, Jason.
Right. Thanks. If I go back 2.5 decades, every single day in almost every single ICU in the world, we are performing spontaneous breathing trials. And you were one of the founders of that, right? And you published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, and that was 1996. And I'm guessing that's before we even recognized the problem of prolonged sedation, immobilization, delirium, and etc. So I don't know. From my perspective, that was the start of your very long journey. If I'm right, or maybe I'm not. So could you talk us through that?
Sure, yes. Just a few years before 1996, I cared for my first patients that I saw their life destroyed, dismantled by critical illness. I didn't know what it was. I mean, I was so confused as a doctor. And I tell the story in the book of Teresa Martin.
Yes,
so you can look her up and read about Teresa Martin. She was my index case of PICS, but we didn't develop the name for PICS for another, 18 years almost. So we were 2 decades ahead of that. But in 1996, we published this paper that I designed a randomized controlled trial of trying to get people off of the ventilator sooner. All I knew was that after Teresa Martin, I needed to get them off the ventilators faster to get them out of that dangerous place of the ICU. So we set up protocols, and that was the way we started. And we proved we could shorten the time in the ICU by 2 days, time on the vent by 2 days, and reduce cost of care by $5,000-$6,000 per person. And that was the beginning for me, but I really had no idea where it was going to go because I didn't even understand that PICS was a thing at that time.
Right. And then shortly after 5 years, 2001, you published the CAM ICU paper in I think it was JAMA. And then 2003, you published on the Richmond Agitation Sedation Scale, and that was JAMA as well. So it became a movement, right? Like using scores proactively detecting patients with delirium who are over sedated. Again, what was that about? What was the intent?
It became a movement, but I didn't know it was going to be a movement at the beginning. What happened with me was that I started seeing. I came to Vanderbilt after that New England Journal of Medicine paper, which I did as a chief resident, by the way, and then came to Vanderbilt and started seeing people in clinic after the ICU, and they couldn't carry on their life. They were losing their jobs. They were having broken relationships. They were losing their house. And I was like, wait a minute, what is going on? Like, I thought we were going to have these triumphant reunions of their life. And Dr. Ely, thank you. You saved me. Instead, there were these broken shell of people. And so I thought, well, something has happened to their brain. Let's figure that out. But there were no tools to measure delirium. We just thought delirium was an innocent bystander of critical illness. So we developed and invented the CAM ICU, which is now available in almost 40 languages and used in all continents. And then we proved that we could combine the CAM ICU with the Richmond Agitation Sedation Scale score. And then we proved in 2000, that was 2001, 2003 JAMA. And then in 2004 JAMA, we published that brain dysfunction predicted death, this was an independent predictor of the likelihood of dying and not related to severity of illness or other things. It was independent of all those things. And that's what started the movement, was the fact that people realized, oh my goodness, this is actually something that's causing people to die. And then we didn't even get to the PICS yet. So that changed my focus to say, well, how do we prevent it? And we started developing clinical trials to prevent the post-intensive care syndrome and to help survival.
Yeah. So talking about prevention, I must confess that I got it all wrong, right? Because I was one of those who used the REST score, and so you sedate them to whatever number you want. Because of your studies, right? The MAN study, which looked at dexmedetomidine versus lorazepam, the SATCOM study, which looked at dexmedetomidine versus midazolam. We don't use benzodiazepines. I mean, we still use propofol, dexmedetomidine. I know you did it in the MANS 2 study, which showed that they were about equivalent. But where I got it absolutely wrong was that I used the CAM ICU, and then I knocked them out with haloperidol, with quetiapine, and then you guys proved in the MIND USA study that these don't work. So how is it that antipsychotics, which are meant to prevent psychosis, do not prevent delirium?
Well, that was a lot there, Jason. Let me unpack some of that. Right. So the MIND study in 2000 and the ABC study in 2007, 2008, what they basically showed was that the older way of sedating people in the ICU with benzodiazepines was inferior to a daily wake up and an avoidance of the GABAergic approach with benzos. Once we knew that we could actually save lives, and we had one of the largest mortality benefits in all of critical care in the ABC study at 1 year, and that we could avoid benzos, that started everybody questioning what we were doing. And then in 2013, we proved that delirium was a predictor of dementia in the New England Journal of Medicine in the brain ICU study. Once we had all of that together, that we were causing dementia, that we were causing death, and that we could avoid it by this newer approach, we started developing this ABCDEF bundle, or what I call the A2F bundle. And I didn't want to write this book until we knew about antipsychotics. So we then went on and developed this multi-center randomized control trial, $9 million from the NIH, and to determine if the antipsychotics were actually doing what we thought they were doing. And you said you got it all wrong. You know, you did the best you could with the light you had at the time, right? With what you understood. But these antipsychotics aren't reducing delirium. What they're doing is shifting patients from hyperactive delirium, where they look agitated, into hypoactive delirium, and they're not shortening the duration of the brain dysfunction. And it's the duration of the brain dysfunction that we know is the predictor of the death and the dementia. So I still use antipsychotics if I have a hyperactive, agitated patient, because it's a way of calming them and avoiding self-extubation and that sort of thing. And they can also tolerate a BiPAP mask when they don't get respiratory suppression. So I'll use either antipsychotics or dexmedetomidine because they don't cause respiratory suppression in that circumstance. But the real genius behind Mind USA study was that it prevented you and me from thinking that we had done enough by simply writing for an antipsychotic. Because if you think about us at the bedside with our patient Jan or Polly or whoever, if we just write a drug and we think we've fixed something, we tend to stop thinking and move on. And now, and I say this in every deep drawn breath, now we don't have that luxury anymore, because we know that if we write that drug, it actually didn't fix the problem. So we have to face the fact that the most robust way to reduce delirium and help the patient better is through the elements of the A2F bundle, like waking them up, getting them out of bed, including the family at the bedside, and all those things that liberate them from the critical care things that we had to do the first day, but may not need anymore on day 2 or day 3 or day 4.
Right. I was really struck when I read your book. I mean, I've been in intensivist for many years, right? And like I guess many intensivists, we just look at the patient, and then we extubate them, we send them to the general wards, and that's it, right? We don't see them. And when we talk to the family about goals of care, we just say that there's a chance that he will survive and all that. But what really struck me when I read your book was how bad it can be after survival of critical illness. I must confess, I did not realize. I mean, I read the journals, but I did not realize it until I read your true life stories. And so maybe give us a few for the people who haven't read your book. How bad can it be if it's not done right for survivors?
Yeah, exactly. Let me tell you a quick story, and then I'm going to read a section, just a couple of paragraphs from the book that'll bring it to life. Is that okay?
Okay.
I was in an Asian country, and I really want the listeners in lower middle income countries around the world to realize that we have you in our sights too for this quality improvement. We want to improve the whole world of critical care, and not just the developed nations by any means, because the people that are most vulnerable to this actually are people of lower socioeconomic means, lower education, who don't have a voice in their own illness and in their life, and or who don't speak the native language of wherever they live. And so those people are very vulnerable. And I was in a lower middle income country that was having a congress on this, and someone was talking about how they had treated this one woman. This woman came in, was brought in the ICU. She was cared for. She was on the ventilator. She got out, and they brought her in a year later, and they wheeled her in a wheelchair. So this is a year after critical care, and this woman is in a wheelchair. She can't walk. She's skin and bones. She's lost all of her muscle mass, has a massive nerve and muscle disease and dementia. And one of the doctors brought up the idea that we should have used less sedation and had her walking and moving via the A2F bundle. And one doctor on one side of the room said, well, what if she had self-extubated? And this woman doctor on the other side of the room said, well, what if she never walks again? And that was everybody just stopped in their tracks and just thought, oh my gosh, that's such a great point. If she self-extubates, we can re-intubate her. But what if we do all this stuff and overreach so much that this woman whom we're looking at in the room never walks again? And that's what's at stake here. But it's also that they just can't do their job. They can't earn money. They lose the electricity in their house. They don't have internet anymore. They can't apply for disability. They can't work for countries that have insurance. They can't function with their insurance. And spouses break up, families break up. It becomes a real personal disaster.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so you said that you wanted to spread this movement, right? How are we supposed to do that?
All right. Well, that's what I'm going to read to you. So this is in the chapter called Spreading the Word in the book, and on page 171. I'm just going to read to you here. This is a quote from a nurse. It's not enough to keep people from dying. We have to save the life that they want to return to, the one they had before they came to us. This was critical care nurse Mary Ann Barnes Daly's mantra when she led a multi-center study across Sutter Health Hospital System in Sacramento, California. 7 community hospitals had received a grant to study the association between the ABCDEF bundle compliance and patient outcomes. Family engagement and empowerment, the F of the bundle, was the new addition and was crucially important. And I'm going to skip a little bit, but Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, had been in an ICU, had gotten sick, and didn't have his family around him, went through delirium, and thought it was a horrible experience. So this billionaire gave some money to the Society of Critical Care Medicine to make this happen. And I met Mary Ann Barnes Daly after she had had a survivor present his own disastrous survivorship. He had had delirium in the ICU with H1N1 flu and ARDS. And he had, in his delirium, he had 3 people in the room every night, and he was forced to go on a game show. This is very gruesome, so sorry if it triggers anybody. A game show to shoot one of the people there, and every night they would pull off the bag, and he kept switching the person, and it was always his own daughter. Terrible. And years later, 10 years after that experience, he was still reliving that nightmare every night from his experience. So we don't want people to suffer like that and develop PTSD. So Mary Ann is taking the 35 to 40 New England Journal, JAMA, and Lancet papers that we used to build the A2F bundle, and she's telling her leadership why they need to do this. And they eventually enroll over 6,000 people in this trial. But here's the story, the 2 paragraphs of, I asked her, how did you build it? How did you create this change? And her nickname is Jet, J-E-T-T. Jet told me how she approached changing the culture of critical care with her hospital system. I went to the ICU in my small hospital, and I told them about the bundle. Here's A and B and C. And I explained everything, and the nurses nodded. I said, so this is what we have to do. This is the new cool stuff. They said, great. 2 weeks later, I went back, and you know what they had done? Nothing. Jet laughed. I can imagine, though, she didn't laugh at the time. Trying to sell people on mortality reduction isn't really meaningful to them. You have to sell patients stories. That was exactly what we had learned to do too. You must sell stories to get people on board. Jet went on. I went to our flagship hospital, Sutter Medical Center in Sacramento, where they were doing a huge nursing meeting. They had to be 60 to 70 nurses in the room. I had an hour. I spent 40 minutes talking to them about how we were hurting people and 20 minutes on what we were going to do to fix it. I told them what sedation did. I told them what tying patients down in bed did, how they couldn't walk or have their jobs back, or how they lost their spouses and families, how they'd rather be dead. I had nurses crying. They thought they were doing the right thing because that's what they were taught. They said, we didn't know. I said, I didn't know. I'm learning all this stuff too, but we're hurting people. We're breaking their brains. Jet had tears in her eyes, and she remembered. She looked back at me. That's what got people hooked. And that's how she did it.
You know, personal experience, right? I mean, I didn't hear you read the stories. I got a book. I read the book. It wasn't an audio version. So I read the stories, and it moved me. Yeah. When I went back to the ICU, I started seeing the problems, right? I started seeing the patients who have been stuck on the ventilator on a tracheostomy for weeks on end, and us not really thinking what he or she actually wanted. I started to ask the family members, how are you guys? And for the first time in many years, I'm hearing family members tell me that they are not great. They're not coping, right? They're not sleeping well, they're not eating well, etc., etc. Exactly what your book said. And I needed those stories to remind myself rather than percentages and p-values on a journal. Yeah. So it makes
exactly.
a real,
I'm so
real
glad you told me
difference.
that. It's so powerful
Yeah.
that you took the initiative in your own life as a physician to try and achieve change. You know, all of us as human beings, we develop a set of tools to get by, to get through, but those tools have got to evolve. They've got to morph and improve over time. And what I've learned about life is that the assets that I developed as a young physician that got me through and developed into me a successful doctor, those assets, when I overused them, Jason, became liabilities for me and my patients. And what I've learned to do now is shed those things that used to help me. Like I used to protect myself by staying removed from the patient, equanimity, equal footing, even keel. And what I realized over time is I don't want to live that way anymore as a doctor. I want to dive into their lives and provide mercy. And my definition of mercy is to dive into the chaos of not just my patient's life, but also the life of the family, and then provide lifting and healing. And it's false mercy just to dive into the chaos. I've been doing that for years. Ventilators are chaos. Pressors are chaos, all that. But I want to provide lifting and healing. And to fully do that, I have to embrace this newer way of being a doctor that you just described, Jason. And you just described it beautifully. And if I can just say, all it involves is switching a preposition from what matters to you to what's, instead of saying what's the matter with you, switching it to say what matters to you. And if you find out what matters to someone, then you can serve them.
Yeah. How about COVID?
Yeah. And what happened in COVID is that COVID made us essentially kind of lose our brains for a minute as doctors and nurses and ICU teams. We thought we're scared. We will get infected ourselves pre-vaccine. And we don't know if PPE works. And so we threw out the bundle. We did a point prevalence study prior to COVID. And in 2017 to 2019, we had proven that we lowered delirium by about 30% from the 70s into the 40s. And it was very consistent. For the first time in the history of modern critical care, we had delirium rates in ventilated people in the 40% range rather than 70% range. And that's because we were using the bundle. But when COVID hit, we just said, get rid of all that. We'll just do whatever we want. And we threw out all this data-driven approaches that we had developed over 15 years. And we brought in new people in the ICU that didn't know about it, the ATF bundle anyway. And we just did a prevalence study. We had gone from about 70 to 80% compliance pre-COVID to 10 to 20% compliance. I mean, it's absolutely sad. And the SCCM is working very diligently with the ICU Liberation Collaborative teams to figure out how are we going to rebuild this moving forward. But you and everybody listening to this podcast can do their part. We have to rebuild this, just like Jet said. And in the lower middle income countries, I can share a story with you that this has to be done there too, because those people are going to suffer just as much, if not more, than anyone, and it's not fair to leave them out.
The lower middle income story. You want to share?
You want me to read that?
That sounds good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
For the past 10 years, I've been working in different regions of Haiti and also in Zambia and other countries, but this is a Haiti story. Haiti is right next to the Dominican Republic in the Caribbean. One of my most memorable opportunities was to participate in a project with Dr. Paul Farmer through Partners in Health and their sister organization, Zami La Sante, ZL, founded in 1987. PIH, a social justice nonprofit, brings high-quality healthcare to impoverished communities around the world. In 2013, opened a university hospital of Mirabelais, a 300-bed facility to provide local care in central Haiti. Usually, I work alongside the Haitian teams in whatever capacity they feel that I can be most helpful for the project. I was collaborating with them to establish state-of-the-art critical care in the world's first Black republic. I was part of the ICU doctors from various US-based hospitals, spending month-long shifts there to partner in building the program. Eventually, it would be sustained by Haitian nurses and physicians. Many of them had trained at hospitals under the leadership of Dr. Carlos St. Cyr, the director of the ICU at Mirabelais. On the first day, while rounding in the sizzling heat in the ICU, I stood with Dr. St. Cyr at the bedside of Mr. Touf Demone, an emaciated man on a mechanical ventilator. Weeks earlier, while plowing a near vertical hillside to plant corn for the coming year, somehow he had fallen, rolled, and smashed into a tree. Several farmers lifted his injured body into the back of a weathered wooden cart pulled by a donkey and brought him 12 miles along rocky, dirty dirt roads to the modern large hospital. To them, it must have looked like a vision of hope. I examined Mr. Demone carefully from head to toe and reviewed his records. He had suffered from a displaced femur fracture during his fall and had quickly developed pneumonia. I thought this might have been initiated by the spread of a fat embolism, fat seeping from the marrow of his cracked thigh bone into his blood vessels and then wreaking havoc in his lungs. Operating was judged too risky by the surgeons. As I listened to the ventilator pushing air into his stiff chest, I was dismayed to see how thin he was. He was suffering the same muscle wasting that Richard Griffiths had described decades earlier in the United Kingdom, that Polly Bailey had seen in Joy Sunloft's body. These are stories I've told earlier in EDDB. All those years earlier and on down the line, I lifted his good leg and saw the outline of his femur. Gone were the lean muscles that had pushed him up the mountains at harvest time. I wasn't sure he would ever walk or work again. How would Mr. Demone fare beyond the hospital, supposing the bone eventually mended, if he was too weak to get around or earn money? And so I began thinking about how he would do when he got out. And Dr. St. Cyr says, you know, for Mr. Demone, it's not enough to simply give him the ventilator. We must figure out how to get him back home safely. Is that doable? And for Miss Charles, another patient I just told a story about above, now that we have her stabilized, we must get that baby delivered or she's going to die. He was right. We had to focus on the task at hand. Just as Paul Farmer and co-founder PIH Ophelia Dahl had vowed, looking out across the countryside under the Haitian night skies and wondering how they would move forward with such a Herculean task. As they gazed in the darkness, they saw pockets of illumination with stoked fires, affirming the Creole mantra, "Can be fem," or stand firm. The fires gave them strength. They assured each other of their work and that it would take shape one person at a time. And I think that's what we have to do, Jason, is one person at a time, one bed at a time, is to provide mercy and lift them up into healing. And that I hope the message of every deep drawn breath teaches us what we've learned in science and in humanity and makes us realize that our job is not technology. It's touch first and technology second. And if we get the order right, and if we kneel down at their bedside or hold their hand or look in their eyes and see that person, the entire person, then we will know our North Star and how to proceed. And I think we have the science. The question is, do we have the guts to make the change?
Thank you, Dr. Ely. Any final words, maybe for families and patients who are going to go through this or are going through this?
Well, to all of your listeners, help draw in the patients and families. And if you go to Amazon or Goodreads and leave a book review of this book and tell them why you think it's important, and it will draw other people into the story. What we have to do is have the families and the patients, the survivors, working with us in the healthcare profession to let us know where we're doing well and where we're not doing well. And I think as we rebuild coming out of the pandemic, we will serve our patients better through using these time-tested, data-driven ways. But much of this, remember, is age-old. It's what does it mean to be a person? And what does it mean to pay attention to the people around us who are suffering? And in so doing, we have to acknowledge that each of us is of infinitesimal value and worth. We are priceless, in other words. And that pricelessness of us is not just about our body that we're fixing in the ICU. It's about our mind and our spirit. And so we have to respect each person's spiritual path, whether they're atheist or agnostic or Buddhist or whatever their spiritual path is. we have to ask them, what is that? And how can I serve you in this way and take care of the entire person? And that essentially is the message of every deep drawn breath. Go to our website, look up the book, icudelirium.org, be a part of this movement and help us to help others. And let me know how I can serve you in the process. Thank you so much, Jason. And I'm found on Twitter at Wes Ely, MD. And I'm here to help you find your way, just like you're helping me find my way.
Thank you, Dr. Ely. I just got to say that I've been extremely inspired just listening to you, even though I've read the book. And to all the listeners, if you're feeling burnt out, the pandemic is not doing good things to your mental health, pick up the book. It will really inspire you and make you remember why you joined healthcare in the first place. And by the way, all proceeds from the book does go back to the ICU patients and the families and the survivors, right? Yeah. So with that, I think that's the end of our podcast. If you like it, please share, like, follow, subscribe, whatever. And until the next time, see you and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.